Welcome to Sign Facts, where every movie hides a secret. Every scene tells a deeper story. And every frame contains details most viewers never notice, from legendary blockbusters and mind-bending science fiction to dark thrillers, unforgettable horror, and hidden cinematic gems. We explore the facts, theories, Easter eggs, behind-the-scenes secrets, and untold stories that make movies truly unforgettable. This isn't just watching movies, this is discovering what lies beneath them. Subscribe to Sign Facts and step beyond the screen. After blasting through the final security gate, the thieves discover massive quantities of confiscated heroin sealed inside evidence packages. Moving quickly, they load the narcotics onto rolling trolleys and send them through the building's ventilation system to a van waiting outside. Before the job is finished, though, the driver, Eddie, secretly pockets one package for himself, hoping to turn a little personal profit without anyone noticing. Once every shipment has been transferred, the robbers detonate explosives that destroy the security cameras, wiping out any evidence of the break-in before vanishing into the night. The next morning, Marcus is having breakfast at home with his wife, Teresa, and their kids, trying to enjoy a normal family moment. The peace doesn't last. Mike soon shows up at the house, and moments later both detectives get an urgent call ordering them to report to the station immediately. When they arrive, Captain Howard is absolutely furious. He tells them heroin worth nearly $100 million has been stolen straight out of police evidence storage. The situation is catastrophic, especially since the robbery looks like an inside job. Internal Affairs sends Agent Allison Sinclair to oversee the investigation, while Howard assigns Ruiz and Sanchez to assist on the case. After clearing the room, Howard privately warns Mike and Marcus just how serious this is. If they don't recover the drugs fast, the FBI will shut down the entire narcotics division of their careers, and everyone else's in the department are hanging by a thread. Determined to get a lead, Mike and Marcus start questioning Jojo, a former drug dealer they know from the streets. Jojo insists he's out of that life and claims he knows nothing about the robbery. Getting nowhere with him, they move on to another contact, a call girl named Max Logan. They ask Max to keep her ears open for anyone in Miami suddenly spending money like a newly crowned drug kingpin. Back at the station, office clerk Francine delivers an important clue. Sanchez has traced the building's air conditioning contract to a man named Manuel Arona. Believing he may be connected, Mike and Marcus head straight to Arona's house. At first nobody answers, but when they notice the door is unlocked, they cautiously go inside and discover a horrifying scene. Arona has been brutally murdered. Searching the residence, they turn up gambling records and financial troubles that start to paint a clear picture. Mike concludes that Arona likely sold the police station's ventilation blueprints to the robbers to pay off his debts, and that the gang killed him afterward to make sure he'd never talk. Driving away from the crime scene, Marcus grows increasingly discouraged. The investigation is going nowhere, and he's afraid the whole department could lose their jobs over the disaster. In frustration, he remarks that Mike would probably be just fine even if everything collapsed, since he already comes from money. The comment immediately strikes a nerve. Mike angrily reminds Marcus that being a police officer has been his dream since childhood, and that he works harder than anyone else on the force, regardless of his money. Realizing he's crossed a line, Marcus apologizes. Meanwhile, Max starts following the detective's instructions. She visits an escort agency called Lady Lush, looking for signs of newly rich criminals celebrating with stolen cash. The search eventually leads her and her roommate Julie to a luxury hotel suite connected to the robbery crew. Inside, they're greeted by Eddie, the gang's driver. He acts friendly, but Julie instantly feels uneasy around him. While Eddie keeps Max entertained downstairs with drinks and samples of the stolen heroin, Julie excuses herself and heads upstairs toward the bathroom. Everything turns deadly the moment Fauchet arrives unexpectedly with his men. Fauchet immediately confronts Eddie after learning he stole some of the heroin for himself and recklessly brought strangers into the operation. Eddie desperately tries to smooth things over, But Fauchette has no interest in excuses. Without hesitation, he shoots Max dead right in front of him, then shoots Eddie in the leg, forcing the terrified driver to beg for his life. The pleading changes nothing. Fauchette's crew kills Eddie too. Upstairs, Julie witnesses the entire massacre. Panicked, she tries to escape before the killers realize she's there, but the gang soon figures out someone else is in the suite and starts hunting her through the building, firing shots as she runs for her life. Eventually they corner her on the rooftop with nowhere left to go. With bullets flying behind her, Julie makes a desperate leap off the roof into the swimming pool below, somehow surviving the jump. She escapes into the Miami night while Fauchette's men lose track of her. As the investigation intensifies, Captain Howard uncovers another crucial detail. Eddie, the driver killed by Fauchette, had once been a police officer himself. That makes it clear he likely used his knowledge of department procedures to help the robbery crew break into the evidence vault. Meanwhile, forensic teams collect lipstick traces Julie left on a drinking glass in the hotel suite, hoping the evidence will help them find the mystery witness before the killers do. At the crime scene, Mike struggles to hide how deeply Max's death affects him. Seeing her body shakes him more than he expected, and he has to quietly step away from the others for a moment to compose himself. Elsewhere in Miami, danger keeps spreading as the escort agency's owner suddenly loses power in her apartment building, and in the darkness, one of Fauchette's assassins silently approaches her residence. At the same time, Marcus is stuck working late into the night again, which only fuels Teresa's frustration. Back home she waits up for him, growing more and more annoyed by his constant absence. When Howard later asks where Mike disappeared to, Marcus explains that his partner went to question the escort agency owner, hoping to identify the woman who escaped Eddie's suite with Max. Mike reaches the apartment building and immediately senses something's wrong as the front door hangs slightly open, and the whole place is dark from the power outage. Drawing his weapon carefully, he moves from room to room in silence and eventually finds the madam dead on her bed. Before he can fully react, one of the robbers attacks him from behind, sending him crashing violently through a window and leaving him unconscious outside the building. Meanwhile, Howard and Marcus get a call from Julie. Terrified and desperate, she insists she'll only speak to Mike. Thinking fast, Howard orders Marcus to pretend to be Mike in order to secure the witness before the killers find her first. Marcus reluctantly goes along with it, takes down Julie's address, and heads there alone. The moment he arrives, everything goes sideways as Julie senses something's off and smashes him with a baseball bat, accusing him of not matching Max's description of Mike. After a chaotic struggle, Marcus finally calms her down enough to explain the situation. Once she trusts him a little, Julie reveals that she witnessed Max being murdered. Marcus offers her witness protection right away, but Julie resists, clearly terrified of ending up trapped in police custody. Their conversation is suddenly cut short by shotgun blasts ripping through the front door. Fauchette's men have already tracked her down. The gunmen storm in, firing wildly. Marcus grabs Julie and her dog while returning fire, manages to kill one of the attackers in the chaos, and rushes Julie out the back before speeding away. During the escape, Julie flatly rejects police protection and instead demands to stay at Mike's apartment. With no better option, Marcus reluctantly agrees and drives her there. When they arrive, he has to talk the building's receptionist into letting them in. The man refuses at first, but after getting disrespectful, he pushes Marcus too far, and Marcus quickly intimidates him into cooperating. Inside, Marcus awkwardly fumbles around in the dark trying to find the light switches while pretending the luxurious apartment belongs to him, assuring Julie the whole time that she's safe there despite clearly not knowing his way around half the place. As they talk, Julie explains she never got a clear look at the robbers' faces, but she did overhear them discussing a major drug deal set to happen in 4 days, a detail that instantly grabs Marcus's attention, since it may be their only lead to recovering the stolen heroin. Before leaving, Marcus warns the receptionist to call Mike the moment he gets home and to keep watch over the apartment in the meantime. Marcus eventually heads back to his own house, where Teresa is waiting in a terrible mood, suspicious about his late nights and strange behavior. She refuses to let him sleep in their bed and banishes him to the couch instead. The next morning, Marcus sees Mike finally show up at the station sporting a nasty head injury from the attack the night before. Furious, Marcus scolds him for disappearing when everyone was trying to reach him. Mike fills him in on the escort agency owner's murder and the ambush that nearly got him killed. The two detectives head to the station gym, where Captain Howard is already waiting. Howard tears into Marcus for killing one of the attackers without securing the witness afterward, then turns on Mike for vanishing during such a critical moment. Marcus finally admits he hid Julie at Mike's apartment because he had nowhere else to take her, and shares the information about the deal happening in 4 days. With no other choice, Howard forces the partners into an absurd arrangement. Marcus has to keep pretending to be Mike in front of Julie, while Mike has to pose as Marcus to avoid exposing the deception. Howard makes it crystal clear that if they don't cooperate, they'll both lose their jobs. So Marcus packs his things and temporarily moves into Mike's apartment with Julie, while Mike relocates to Marcus's house to protect Teresa and the kids from possible retaliation. Teresa is completely confused by the arrangement, but Marcus hurriedly lies and tells her he's being temporarily reassigned to Cleveland for work. Meanwhile, at Faucet's hideout, the crew works around the clock preparing the stolen heroin for distribution. The chemists complain that excess moisture is slowing things down, but Faucet has no patience for excuses. He grows more impatient by the second as the deadline approaches. Back at Mike's apartment, Julie starts questioning Marcus about the dozens of framed photos of another man covering the walls, jokingly asking whether he secretly likes men. Trying to stay in character, Marcus improvises, claiming the photos belong to his best friend, Marcus Burnett, who supposedly saved his life countless times. He hands the pictures, out of loyalty and respect. Later, Marcus has Julie look through mugshots on his computer, hoping she can identify the gang members. She struggles for a while, unable to recognize anyone, but during a heated argument over what food to order, she suddenly spots one of the robbers in the files. Elsewhere, Mike settles into Marcus's family life surprisingly well, entertaining the kids by turning stories from his police career into exaggerated bedtime adventures. Back at the apartment, Marcus and Julie spend their evening cleaning up after Julie's dog, Duke, who keeps making a mess wherever he goes. The next morning, Mike catches Marcus casually wearing one of his expensive silk shirts without permission. Annoyed, he retaliates by pretending to flirt with Teresa over the phone just to irritate Marcus even more. A little later, Mike secretly approaches Francine and tries to get access to Eddie's records, but the files are protected behind a security lock she can't bypass. Soon after, Mike returns to the apartment with Marcus, where Julie announces she wants to join them on their next trip to the nightclub. She's tired of hiding indoors and refuses to stay trapped in the apartment any longer. At that exact moment, Mike notices disgusting stains Duke has left on his expensive rug. Julie casually explains that the dog gets nervous in unfamiliar places. Mike nearly explodes over the ruined carpet, but with Julie still believing Marcus is Mike, he has no choice but to swallow his anger and stay quiet. While Mike keeps discovering new stains and damage all over his apartment courtesy of Duke, another awkward situation appears. His personal masseuse, Yvette, casually walks in expecting to see Mike as usual. Marcus panics and rushes to push her back out the door before Julie notices anything suspicious, and pretending he has no idea who she is only makes things messier. When Mike later learns what happened, he explodes in frustration, sparking another loud argument between the two detectives. Marcus finally cuts the shouting short and reminds everyone they have bigger things to worry about. Specifically Noah, the gangster Julie identified from the mugshots. Later that night, one of Faucet's crew is assigned to guard a van loaded with ether. a chemical needed to process the heroin. Around the same time, Mike and Marcus arrive at a crowded nightclub to search for Noah, splitting up to cover more ground. The operation quickly goes wrong. Marcus is recognized by Casper, one of the gang members who survived the shootout at Max's apartment. Meanwhile, Julie secretly decides she wants revenge for Max's murder and heads to the club herself, armed with a gun. Inside, Marcus gets ambushed. One attacker slips a plastic bag over his head while Casper moves in with a knife, trying to finish him off quietly in the middle of the packed crowd. Marcus fights back desperately, kicking wildly and struggling for air until he finally breaks free. Casper grabs him again and hurls him through a massive fish tank, sending water and shattered glass everywhere. Marcus's gun slides across the floor, and Casper scrambles for a tab, but when he tries to fire, nothing happens because the safety is still on. Marcus uses the opening to overpower and beat him down. Elsewhere in the club, Julie spots Fauchette on an upper balcony and, fueled by anger, raises her weapon to shoot him herself. Just before she pulls the trigger, Marcus lunges for her gun, throwing off her aim and causing the shot to miss. The gunfire throws the club into total chaos, with screaming people rushing for the exits while Mike, Marcus, and Julie steal the gang's van and speed away. Noah and another gangster chase them in a car, opening fire through the streets of Miami. During the chase, Mike retaliates by tossing drums of ether out of the van and shooting them mid-air. The explosions engulf Noah's vehicle in flames before it erupts into a massive fireball. Although they survive the chase, the detectives realize they may have just lost their only solid lead. Afterward, they stop at a convenience store so Julie can buy shampoo and other supplies. While there, Marcus and Mike start piecing together another theory. Since the heroin operation depends heavily on chemists, they conclude Jojo may still be connected because of his chemistry background. Even this quick stop turns chaotic as the nervous store owner notices the detectives carrying guns and assumes they're robbers, pulling a shotgun on them. Mike and Marcus distract him by loudly arguing with each other before suddenly turning their weapons on him instead. Later that night at Mike's apartment, Julie starts growing emotionally attached to the man she still believes is Mike. She tries flirting with Marcus, but he immediately shuts her down. She then starts complimenting Mike instead, talking about how lucky his wife must be to have someone so handsome and charming. Meanwhile, at Marcus's actual house, Mike spends time with Teresa flipping through old family photo albums, laughing at Marcus's embarrassing younger photos while Teresa enjoys the company. Back at the apartment, Julie keeps talking admiringly about Mike, which slowly drives Marcus crazy with jealousy and suspicion. Eventually he decides to call home to check on Teresa, but Mike answers the phone standing right beside her, and the way their conversation sounds makes Marcus immediately assume the worst. Convinced something inappropriate is going on between his partner and his wife, Marcus rushes to his own house with Julie riding along. He parks nearby so no one notices him arrive, handcuffs Julie to the steering wheel, and sneaks off alone to spy on the house. At the same time, Mike notices a suspicious blue car parked outside and alerts Sanchez and Ruiz. Inside that car, two of Fauchette's men spot Marcus creeping around his own property in the dark. Marcus climbs toward a second-floor window to peek in at Mike and Teresa, but while sneaking around he slips and crashes into some trash cans, instantly giving himself away. Hearing the noise, Mike rushes outside with his gun drawn and tackles Marcus, thinking he's an intruder. The two detectives wrestle in the yard, yelling at each other in complete confusion, until Teresa storms outside and catches the whole ridiculous scene. Marcus accuses Mike of sleeping with his wife. Mike shouts back that nothing happened. The misunderstanding spirals into absurdity as both men scream accusations while trying to explain themselves. Nearby, Fauchette's men consider using the distraction to attack while the detectives are vulnerable, but before they can act, Sanchez and Ruiz arrive just in time and arrest them. Eventually Mike and Marcus realize what actually happened and awkwardly apologize to each other before getting back to their ridiculous charade. Later at the station, Internal Affairs Agent Allison Sinclair confronts Howard about suspicious calls made from the department to the nightclub. Howard refuses to cooperate, and Allison storms off furiously. Meanwhile, one of the arrested gangsters reveals the only useful thing he knows, the name Fauchet. Determined to push the investigation forward, Mike and Marcus track down Jojo again, this time chasing him down aggressively and holding him at gunpoint until he breaks. While Julie waits handcuffed in the car, Mike leans on Jojo hard enough to get him to reveal information about Fauchet's chemist. That night, the trio stakes out the chemist's house for hours without seeing any movement. It's not until the following day that the chemist finally emerges and secretly travels to a hidden location at the docks. Watching from a distance, Mike and Marcus try to figure out how to approach carefully. Julie, though, gets too curious and uses binoculars to get a closer look at the hideout. Unfortunately, Fauchet notices her watching and immediately orders his men to follow the detectives. Elsewhere, Marcus's kids and Teresa watch television coverage of the previous night's police chase, and Teresa, realizing Marcus lied about being transferred to Cleveland, becomes furious over his deception. Later, back at Mike's apartment, Julie secretly steals the key to her handcuffs. Only minutes afterward, Teresa unexpectedly shows up looking for Marcus. The moment Teresa starts speaking openly, Julie finally realizes the truth. Marcus isn't Mike at all. Feeling betrayed and humiliated after being lied to the entire time, she storms out of the apartment in anger, while Teresa furiously tells Marcus not to bother coming home. Mike desperately tries to stop Julie from leaving while Marcus chases after Teresa, begging her to listen. Teresa, though, has completely lost patience. Furious over the lies and chaos surrounding the whole situation, she sarcastically tells Marcus he might as well keep his wedding ring in his pocket and go stay with Mike and his other girlfriend instead. Neither detective manages to calm the women down, and the argument spills all the way into the building's lobby. Suddenly, the confrontation is interrupted when Fauchet and his men arrive outside and unleash a barrage of gunfire into the building. Mike and Marcus immediately draw their weapons and fire back, trying to protect Julie and Teresa. In the confusion, Fauchet's crew manages to grab Julie and drag her into their vehicle before speeding off. Mike takes off after them on foot, sprinting through the streets as bullets fly around him. The chase turns increasingly reckless as the gang crashes their car and escapes into a nearby studio complex. Mike keeps pursuing them across rooftops and through a crowded beauty salon while dodging gunfire from every direction. Eventually the criminals hijack a taxi after killing the driver and force the vehicle back onto the road. Marcus spots the cab and rushes toward it, leaping onto the moving vehicle in a desperate attempt to stop them, but loses his grip and tumbles into its path. At the last possible second, Mike dives forward and shoves Marcus out of danger before the taxi can crush him. The robbers escape once again, but Mike's quick reaction saves his partner's life. Back at the station, Fauchet contacts Mike personally. Calm and threatening, he warns Mike to stay away from the upcoming drug exchange, or Julie will end up dead, just like the chemist Fauchet has already executed. At the same time, Allison Sinclair informs the detectives they're being reassigned because of the destruction and failures piling up around the case. Captain Howard refuses to give up, though he tells Mike and Marcus they still have 4 hours before the deal happens and orders them to use every remaining minute to catch Fauchet. Working frantically against the clock, the detectives bring in a convict with hacking skills to access Eddie's old police records, and the search uncovers another shocking connection. Francine had secretly been Eddie's girlfriend. When confronted, Francine finally breaks down and admits she fed Eddie and Fauchet information about narcotics operations after they blackmailed her. Realizing there's no way out, she gives the detectives contact numbers connected to the gang. Using that information, the police trace Fauchet's location, and Sanchez and Ruiz join the operation. Meanwhile, Captain Howard assembles a SWAT team in preparation for a full-scale assault. The trail eventually leads them to an abandoned aircraft hangar, where Fauchet and his men are negotiating a massive heroin deal with a powerful crime lord. Inside, Julie notices the gang is distracted during the negotiations and quietly uses the stolen key to unlock her handcuffs while the police teams move into position outside. The moment the exchange is completed, the cops smash through the hangar entrance with a truck, launching a full raid that throws the operation into chaos. Fauchette immediately takes advantage of the confusion by murdering the crime lord himself before anyone can react. At the same time, Julie breaks completely free and drives a nearby vehicle straight into the stored ether barrels, jumping clear only seconds before the collision triggers a massive explosion. The hangar erupts into total warfare as gunfire explodes from every direction, criminals and officers exchanging bullets while Mike and Marcus fight their way deeper inside trying to reach Julie. In the middle of the chaos, Fauchette spots Julie exposed in the open and aims his weapon at her, but before he can fire, Marcus throws himself forward and shoves her out of the line of fire. The bullets miss Julie but slam into Marcus's leg instead, badly wounding him. Elsewhere in the hangar, Casper tries to flee with the deal money aboard a small airplane. Marcus reacts quickly and shoots several ether containers beneath the aircraft. The resulting blast destroys the plane and sets the stolen cash on fire. Fauchette watches another one of his men get gunned down by Mike and realizes the operation is collapsing. He jumps into a nearby sports car and speeds across the airfield in a last attempt to escape. Mike leaps onto the moving car trying to stop him, but Fauchette shoots him directly in the chest. Fortunately, the bullet hits Mike's vest, though the impact still knocks him off the vehicle. Marcus and Julie quickly pick Mike up, and together they continue pursuing Fauchette across the runway. Just as the drug lord is about to break free, Marcus slams his vehicle into Fauchette's sports car, sending it crashing violently into a barrier. The wrecked criminal crawls from the destroyed car trying to escape on foot, but Mike shoots him in the leg and kicks his weapon away. Bleeding and cornered, Fauchette taunts Mike and dares him to finish it. Marcus tells Mike the man isn't worth it, convincing him to lower his gun and spare him. But the moment the detectives turn their backs, Fauchette secretly pulls another hidden weapon and prepares to shoot them again. This time Mike reacts without hesitation, unloading his entire gun into Fauchette and finally ending the nightmare for good. Later, while paramedics treat their injuries, Mike and Marcus sit together, exhausted after surviving the chaos. For once, both openly acknowledge how much they value each other as partners and friends. Julie jokingly asks where exactly she belongs within their strange partnership. Marcus grins, handcuffs her to Mike, and walks off to finally reconcile with Teresa, leaving Mike stuck dealing with the situation alone once again. When Bad Boys begins, it doesn't waste much time pretending it's aiming for subtlety. Within minutes, the film makes clear exactly what kind of experience it intends to deliver. Pulsing music, polished cars, detectives arguing in the middle of unfolding chaos, Miami glowing like a city permanently suspended in golden hour light. The movie immerses you in its atmosphere before the central plot has even fully settled into place. And honestly, the premise itself is remarkably straightforward. A massive shipment of heroin is stolen directly from a Miami police evidence vault, not from a cartel operation, not from some hidden street network, but from the police themselves. That immediately creates a deeply embarrassing, high-pressure situation, with the department urgently needing results before outside agencies arrive and seize control of the investigation. That's where Mike Lowry and Marcus Burnett enter the picture. They're narcotics detectives, longtime partners, and complete opposites in temperament. But the film introduces them less like polished investigators and more like two men who've been arguing non-stop for over a decade. Even in serious situations, they can't stop interrupting each other, and that dynamic appears almost instantly, quickly becoming more central than the drug investigation itself. Before the movie fully embraces its buddy comedy identity, though, it establishes the witness angle that drives nearly everything afterward. One of Mike's acquaintances, Max, gets entangled with the criminals connected to the heroin theft and is eliminated after witnessing too much, but her friend Julie manages to escape. Julie immediately becomes the key witness everyone's searching for. The police need her protected, The criminals need her silenced. It's a familiar setup, certainly. But the film escalates it with that distinctly mid-90s action thriller energy, where every conversation already feels loud, urgent, and unstable. What I genuinely appreciate about this opening stretch is how rapidly the movie generates momentum. It's especially elegant storytelling in that sense. In fact, once you start examining the logic too closely, some of the cracks show surprisingly early. But the pacing carries this restless propulsion that keeps pushing forward. Michael Bay shoots even ordinary conversations as if something explosive could erupt within the next 30 seconds, and then the movie introduces the narrative device that ultimately defines the entire story. Julie insists she'll only speak to Mike. The problem is Mike isn't there when she finally reaches out, so Marcus pretends to be Mike to keep her cooperating. That single impulsive decision spirals into an elaborate identity switch situation that the entire film builds itself around. Even audiences who genuinely enjoy Bad Boys usually acknowledge how absurd this premise becomes. It's one of those concepts where the longer it continues, the less practical it feels. There are several moments where you instinctively want someone to just tell the truth and end the misunderstanding, but the film clearly understands that the confusion itself is where the comedy lives. Suddenly Marcus has to impersonate this wealthy bachelor living Mike's glamorous lifestyle, while Mike gets dragged into Marcus's domestic family life. The movie repeatedly mines humor from that contrast, and surprisingly, it keeps working far longer than logic suggests it should. Still, during these early sequences, what truly stands out is the confidence with which the film throws you into its world. It feels unmistakably mid-90s in both the best and worst ways at once. Everyone is sweating, yelling, flirting, threatening someone, driving recklessly, or standing dramatically beside neon lighting. While music dominates the background, the movie doesn't quietly build atmosphere and delivers it at maximum volume, and strangely enough, that approach works. There's also a very specific movie Miami energy running through everything. A not realistic Miami, but cinematic Miami, a fantasy version of the city built from expensive cars, palm trees, nightclubs, waterfront apartments, detectives who somehow resemble fashion models, and criminals seemingly plugged into international drug money networks. The exaggeration is obvious from the start, but eventually that heightened quality becomes part of the film's identity and charm. At the same time, you can already tell the movie isn't deeply invested in the investigation itself. The stolen heroin may technically be the main plot, but emotionally the film cares far more about placing these characters into increasingly chaotic situations and watching how they react to one another. Honestly, that turns out to be the right creative decision, because the opening functions less like a gripping crime thriller and more like a launch platform for the chemistry between Will Smith and Martin Lawrence. The case gives the movie momentum, but the personalities give it identity. Without that, this probably would have become just another forgotten 90s cop film buried in a discount DVD bin somewhere. Instead, the setup creates an unusual fusion of action-driven tension and sitcom-style misunderstanding that somehow becomes entertaining purely because the film commits to it so aggressively. The element that truly makes Bad Boys work, and honestly, the reason the franchise exists at all, is the relationship between Mike and Marcus. Everything else feels secondary: the drugs, the villains, the investigation, the explosions. Almost any generic action thriller framework could probably replace those elements, and the movie would still function, because this is one of those rare films where the connection between the two leads essentially is the movie. What's interesting is how quickly the film recognizes that. There are plenty of buddy cop movies where the chemistry takes time to settle, where you can practically feel the actors discovering the rhythm scene by scene. Bad Boys doesn't really struggle with the Smith and Lawrence arrive arguing immediately. Not polished movie banter, either. Not that perfectly timed Hollywood dialogue where every comeback feels engineered weeks in advance. Their conversations feel disorderly and interruptive half the time. It genuinely sounds like they're irritating each other. That's precisely why it works. Mike and Marcus don't initially feel like action heroes. They feel like two men who've spent far too many hours together in cars, crime scenes, interrogation rooms, and fast food drive-thrus over the years. There's constant irritation between them, but underneath it all, the loyalty feels completely believable. The film leans heavily into that exhausted couple energy. There are scenes where they barely resemble police partners anymore and instead behave like two people trying to survive each other's personalities. After years of mutual frustration, Marcus loses patience every few minutes. Mike intentionally presses every possible button simply because he enjoys watching Marcus unravel. Their arguments escalate over tiny details in the middle of high-stakes situations. One of them tries to focus while the other drifts into completely irrelevant conversation, and somehow the movie becomes more entertaining because of that instability. What I appreciate is that neither character fully dominates the dynamic. Many buddy cop movies quietly assign one main personality while the other simply reacts around him. Here, both men constantly compete for control of every scene. Smith brings effortless confidence and undeniable movie star presence, while Lawrence injects this anxious, loud, unpredictable energy that keeps the film from becoming too polished or self-serious. Marcus especially feels like the human embodiment of stress. He's always frustrated about something: his family, his career, Mike's behavior, the danger surrounding them, random inconveniences that barely matter. He reacts emotionally to everything, and that gives the film its frantic comedic rhythm. Mike, meanwhile, moves through the movie like he stepped straight out of a luxury ad. Calm under pressure, consistently composed, always focused on looking stylish even with bullets flying nearby. The contrast is obviously exaggerated, but that's entirely the point. Honestly, the film extracts a surprising amount of entertainment from simple conversation alone. Some of the most effective scenes aren't even built around action. It's just Mike and Marcus sitting in a car exchanging nonsense, arguing over who's embarrassing whom, or completely dismantling serious moments because neither one is willing to let his ego rest for even a few seconds. That rhythm carries the entire movie, even when the plot begins to thin out, and it absolutely does at certain points. The chemistry between them keeps the scenes alive. There are stretches where the investigation itself almost fades into the background because the film becomes far more interested in watching Mike and Marcus collide conversationally. And strangely enough, you never really resent that shift. You can also feel how much the movie trusts its leads. Michael Bay brings an enormous amount of visual style to the film, but one of the smarter decisions he makes here is constantly returning focus to the two central personalities. He understands the audience isn't just showing up for explosions or action sequences. They're showing up for the dynamic. There's even a loose, almost improvisational quality to portions of the dialogue. Certain exchanges don't feel tightly engineered at all, more discovered in the moment, which gives the friendship a more believable texture. And honestly, I think that's part of why people remember the original Bad Boys more fondly than many other 90s action films that may have technically had stronger stories. Chemistry is much harder to manufacture than spectacle. You can spend millions staging elaborate explosions and high-speed chases and still create something emotionally empty if the central duo feels disconnected. Will Smith and Martin Lawrence never feel disconnected on screen together, even when a joke doesn't fully land. Even when certain scenes linger longer than they should, there's still an undeniable energy between them. Honestly, that's probably the defining word for the entire film: energy. Not sophistication, not emotional depth, energy. The movie moves as though it's drawing momentum directly from the personalities of its two leads. And once that dynamic fully locks into place, Bad Boys stops feeling like just another buddy cop movie recycling older formulas and starts feeling distinctly like its own thing. Chaotic at times, relentlessly loud, but genuinely alive in a way many action comedies never quite achieve. And really, that's what turned Mike and Marcus into characters audiences actually wanted to revisit for decades. What keeps Bad Boys from blending completely into the background alongside countless other 90s cop movies is how aggressively it constructs Mike Lowry and Marcus Burnett as opposites, not subtle opposites, either. The film introduces them like two men from entirely separate worlds who somehow ended up sharing the same badge. Mike is essentially the fantasy version of a Miami detective. Expensive apartment, expensive car, tailored clothing, limitless confidence. He moves through the movie with the awareness of someone who assumes cameras are following him at all times. And even in dangerous situations he stays composed. Smith plays him with an effortless coolness that rarely feels forced. Mike doesn't come across as a man struggling through life. He feels like someone enjoying it slightly more than he probably should. Then there's Marcus, who seems exhausted before the movie even properly begins. He's married, has kids, lives in permanent domestic chaos, and constantly sounds as though life itself has personally targeted him. Lawrence plays him with non-stop nervous energy, where even ordinary conversations feel one step away from emotional collapse. He's always yelling, always stressed, always trying to survive Mike's behavior while simultaneously being dragged deeper into it. And honestly, the contrast between them becomes so exaggerated it almost drifts into caricature. But that heightened quality is exactly why it succeeds. The film understands that these two lifestyles become inherently funny once they're forced together. Mike has money, freedom, confidence, women, sports cars, essentially the fantasy version of bachelor life. Marcus has responsibility, bills, family arguments, kids climbing all over the house. He's the one who has to explain himself at home while Mike disappears into another expensive action sequence. There's a constant sense that Marcus quietly envies aspects of Mike's life while also believing Mike is completely absurd, and Mike absolutely enjoys making Marcus miserable. That tension fuels nearly every scene they share. One detail I genuinely appreciate is that the movie never frames Marcus as uncool in a pathetic sense. He's frustrated, certainly, but he also becomes the emotional grounding force of the partnership. Mike behaves fearlessly because very little seems to anchor him emotionally. Marcus has a family waiting for him at home, so danger affects him differently. When chaos erupts, Marcus reacts like someone who genuinely has too much to lose, while Mike reacts as if it's just another workday. Because the movie pushes those differences so hard, the identity switch storyline becomes even more entertaining later on. Watching Marcus attempt to impersonate Mike works specifically because he's so clearly unsuited for that lifestyle. He looks uncomfortable inside Mike's world almost immediately. The expensive apartment, the bachelor image, the polished confidence. Marcus wears all of it like someone in borrowed clothes that never quite fit. Meanwhile, Mike stepping into Marcus's domestic life creates an entirely different kind of discomfort. Suddenly this ultra-composed playboy has to navigate family routines, responsibilities, and emotional expectations he normally avoids. The movie gets an impressive amount of comedy simply from watching both men struggle inside each other's environments. What truly makes it work, though, is that beneath all the exaggeration, the film quietly establishes genuine respect between them. They insult each other constantly, but it never feels malicious. Mike clearly trusts Marcus completely. Marcus complains about Mike non-stop, but the second things get dangerous, there's never hesitation between them. That distinction matters, because weaker buddy cop films often confuse constant arguing with authentic chemistry. Bad Boys avoids that trap because you genuinely believe these men share years of history together. And honestly, their personalities reveal quite a bit about the era itself. Mike feels like pure 90s action movie fantasy masculinity. Stylish, fearless, wealthy, endlessly confident, perpetually in control. Marcus feels more grounded and recognizable, the overworked man trying to balance ordinary life against increasingly absurd circumstances. The film almost splits audience fantasy into two halves. One character represents the life people imagine, the other represents the life people actually recognize. Interestingly, Marcus often becomes the funnier and more human character because of that. There are moments where Mike almost feels too polished, too composed, too effortlessly cool. Marcus constantly disrupts the film's sleek image by panicking, overreacting, yelling, or simply saying exactly what's on his mind. He interrupts the movie's smoothness in a way that actually improves it. Without him, Bad Boys probably becomes just another glossy action film full of attractive people posing beside explosions. Instead, the contrast between Mike and Marcus gives the movie personality and not emotional depth exactly. This isn't an intricate character study, but personality. The film fully understands these characters are built from recognizable archetypes, the wealthy bachelor detective and the exhausted family man partner, but Smith and Lawrence perform them with enough energy, irritation, and strangely genuine affection toward each other that the relationship feels alive instead of recycled. And honestly, that's probably why audiences stayed attached to them for so many years, not because either character was especially original on paper, but because together they created a chaotic balance the film could continuously explore. The older I get, the more I realize chemistry in movies is one of those qualities you simply cannot engineer artificially. Studios attempted constantly pairing major actors, handing them clever dialogue, surrounding them with action sequences and polished soundtracks, hoping audiences feel some kind of spark. Sometimes it works, very often it doesn't. With Bad Boys, though, the chemistry between Will Smith and Martin Lawrence genuinely is the movie. Strip that away, and what remains is honestly a fairly standard 90s action framework built around narcotics, shootouts, and exhausted police captains yelling through overcrowded offices. But the moment these two start talking to each other, the film suddenly comes alive. What makes it feel so natural is that their energy never seems overly polished in that heavily engineered Hollywood way. They interrupt each other constantly. They ramble. Half their conversations feel like they drifted accidentally off script, and Michael Bay simply kept the cameras rolling because the result felt more entertaining. There's a loose, conversational rhythm between them that gives scenes genuine movement. Mike and Marcus don't exchange dialogue like action heroes setting up punchlines. They argue like actual friends who know each other far too well. They talk over each other's jokes. They react emotionally to insignificant comments. One starts a sentence, the other cuts him off before it even finishes. After a while, that chaos becomes strangely believable, and honestly, I think that's one of the main reasons the movie still works even when the plot itself becomes increasingly messy. You simply enjoy spending time with these characters. That sounds simple, but it matters enormously. There are action films where supposedly important events happen every few minutes, yet the characters themselves feel completely lifeless. Bad Boys can pause its investigation for extended stretches just so Mike and Marcus can argue inside a car, and somehow the scenes remain entertaining purely because the interaction itself carries momentum. Will Smith especially operates with an extraordinary level of movie star confidence here, not forced confidence, either. He moves through scenes with the relaxed assurance of someone who already knows audiences are going to respond to him. There's a smoothness to his performance that could easily have become irritating with a wrong scene partner, but Martin Lawrence balances him perfectly. Lawrence brings unpredictability, panic, noise. He reacts to every situation as though the universe has specifically chosen him for punishment that day. And because Mike stays relatively composed while Marcus emotionally spirals through almost every scenario, their scenes develop natural comedic tension almost automatically. One man is trying to preserve composure, the other is one inconvenience away from yelling at strangers in public. That imbalance is what makes the banter work so consistently. And honestly, the movie becomes funnier because neither actor seems overly protective of his image. Smith obviously carries the polished movie star presence, but he still lets Mike look ridiculous at times. Lawrence, especially, is completely willing to embarrass himself for the sake of comedy. The film benefits enormously from that absence of vanity. Their dynamic feels messy and human rather than carefully controlled. You also completely believe the history between them, which is crucial, because buddy cop movies live or die based on whether the audience believes these characters actually exist outside the screenplay. Mike and Marcus feel like they've spent years together before the movie even begins. There's irritation between them, but also familiarity. They know exactly how to provoke each other because they've probably been doing it for years. Even the insults eventually start feeling strangely affectionate. What separates their chemistry from many other action comedy pairings, I think, is that neither one functions as a sidekick. They both dominate scenes in entirely different ways. Smith naturally pulls attention through charisma, but Lawrence controls the emotional rhythm of scenes. The second Marcus starts panicking or ranting, the whole atmosphere shifts immediately. The movie stops being about solving a case and becomes about surviving Marcus's stress levels. What's especially interesting is that some of the film's strongest moments barely involve action at all. They're simply conversations, ridiculous conversations, honestly, complaints, misunderstandings, pointless arguments, random observations. But the performances elevate them so effectively that those scenes become more memorable than some of the actual shootouts. You can tell the filmmakers gradually recognize this during production. There are long stretches where the plot almost disappears because the movie understands audiences are enjoying the interaction far more than the investigation itself. The heroin case matters structurally, certainly, but emotionally the movie is driven almost entirely by personality. That's why even people who criticize Bad Boys for being shallow or formulaic still tend to praise Smith and Lawrence together, as their chemistry cuts directly through the familiar structure and makes recycled buddy cop material feel fresh, simply because the actors are clearly enjoying bouncing off each other. Honestly, there's a strong argument that Bad Boys became influential less because of the explosions or Bay's visual style and more because of this specific partnership dynamic. A lot of later action comedies tried to recreate the same energy as a fast-talking partnership, the constant arguing, the friends behaving like enemies for most of the runtime formula. But chemistry like this is difficult to imitate because it depends more on timing than writing. Smith and Lawrence naturally lock into each other's rhythm, even when jokes don't fully land, even when scenes linger too long, even when the plot becomes completely absurd. They still keep the movie entertaining, because watching them interact never fully stops being enjoyable. That's the real accomplishment of Bad Boys. Not the action, not the narrative complexity, just two performers carrying an entire film through sheer personality and momentum. The identity switch storyline in Bad Boys is honestly one of those concepts that feels simultaneously brilliant and completely ridiculous, depending on the exact moment you're watching it. The entire situation begins because Julie insists she'll only speak to Mike. Mike isn't available. Marcus answers instead. And rather than resolving the misunderstanding like rational adults, the movie essentially decides, no, let's transform this into a full-scale personality exchange experiment and push it as far as possible. From that point on, the film commits to the deception with complete confidence. Marcus has to pretend he's Mike. Mike has to cover for Marcus. Everyone starts juggling fake identities, fake lifestyles, fabricated relationships, and increasingly implausible explanations for why none of this should raise suspicion. The longer it continues, the more absurd it becomes. Honestly, I kind of admire the film for escalating the premise instead of retreating from it, because logically the entire setup should collapse almost immediately. There are countless moments where a single honest sentence could resolve everything, as a screenplay constantly stretches credibility just to keep the misunderstanding alive. Sometimes it genuinely feels like the script is sprinting ahead while common sense struggles to catch up somewhere behind it. But the strange thing is that even as the premise becomes more ridiculous, the comedy often improves. That's the trade-off the movie knowingly makes. The identity switch angle gives Smith and Lawrence endless opportunities to psychologically torment each other. Marcus suddenly has to navigate Mike's polished bachelor lifestyle, and he's overwhelmed almost instantly. Walking through expensive apartments, trying to sound smooth, trying to project confidence, trying to convince people this glamorous image belongs to him. And he's absolutely terrible at it. Not subtly terrible, either. Everything about Marcus communicates stressed family man attempting to impersonate someone cooler than himself. He overexplains everything, panics constantly, and reacts emotionally to situations Mike would glide through effortlessly. Watching him attempt to perform Mike's lifestyle becomes funnier precisely because Marcus fundamentally doesn't belong in that world. Meanwhile, Mike being pulled into Marcus's domestic reality creates an entirely different kind of comedy. Suddenly this polished bachelor detective has to navigate family responsibilities, suspicious conversations with Marcus's wife, and all the emotional unpredictability attached to Marcus's normal life. Will Smith plays those sequences with the expression of someone slowly realizing he dramatically underestimated how exhausting Marcus's everyday reality actually is. What allows the premise to function far better than it logically should is that it exposes how differently these two men experience life itself. Mike treats danger like adrenaline. Marcus treats danger like another reason his blood pressure is about to reach catastrophic levels. So once they're forced into each other's routines, the movie gradually stops being about the investigation and starts becoming about personality collision. It's essentially a buddy cop film transforming into a farce midway through its runtime. And yes, there are definitely moments where it pushes the concept too far. Certain scenes stretch the misunderstanding so aggressively that the movie almost starts resembling a sitcom trapped inside an action thriller. You can practically feel the screenplay protecting the gimmick, since the gimmick itself is generating most of the comedy. Some lies become unnecessarily elaborate, characters overlook painfully obvious truths, situations escalate purely because nobody communicates properly for extended stretches of time. But honestly, that instability becomes part of the entertainment. The film isn't asking you to admire the realism of the setup, it's asking you to enjoy watching two fundamentally incompatible personalities try to survive inside each other's identities without the whole thing collapsing publicly. And usually the reactions themselves become the funniest element. Marcus grows increasingly frustrated the deeper he sinks into Mike's world. Mike becomes increasingly irritated, cleaning up the consequences afterward. Their arguments start feeling even more personal because now they're interfering directly with each other's lives, not just each other's jobs. There's also a subtle walk a mile in my shoes element hidden underneath all the absurdity. The movie never explores it with any real emotional depth, but forcing Mike and Marcus into each other's lifestyles does create occasional moments where they accidentally begin understanding each other more clearly. Marcus starts recognizing how lonely Mike's glamorous lifestyle actually is beneath all the confidence and polish. Mike starts realizing Marcus's domestic life isn't merely exhausting chaos, but responsibility, pressure, and commitment, all the things Mike typically avoids. Again, the movie never slows down long enough to fully examine those ideas. It stays primarily focused on jokes, gunfire, arguments, and escalating confusion. But those quieter observations are still present beneath the surface. Honestly, the identity switch premise is probably the clearest example of bad boys choosing entertainment over logic at every possible opportunity. A more grounded film would have ended the misunderstanding almost immediately. Bad Boys notices the misunderstanding is working and essentially decides to keep it going until complete collapse. At times, it absolutely feels forced. Occasionally it drifts dangerously close to cartoon logic. But because Smith and Lawrence commit so completely to the material, the movie usually escapes the consequences of its own absurdity barely. And strangely enough, the fact that the premise is somewhat ridiculous eventually becomes part of the charm. The film understands it's operating on heightened buddy comedy logic. It's not trying to convince you this scenario would unfold in real life. It simply wants the chaos that emerges when two completely different men become trapped inside each other's identities while bullets, criminals, and domestic disasters keep crashing into them from every direction, which, to be fair, is an impressively entertaining disaster to watch unfold. Watching Bad Boys now is genuinely fascinating, because you're essentially witnessing Michael Bay becoming Michael Bay in real time, before the enormous robot spectacles, before Pearl Harbor, before people started casually using the term Bayify. This was the film where all those instincts first fully appeared on screen. And honestly, even people who strongly dislike Bay's filmmaking style, which many absolutely do, can already see the blueprint forming here almost immediately. What's interesting, though, is that Bad Boys still feels relatively restrained compared to what Bay would later become, not restrained in a conventional filmmaking sense. Obviously, the movie still features sports cars racing through Miami streets, dramatic slow motion, massive explosions, screaming police captains, nightclub shootouts, and smoke drifting through windows for no apparent reason. All the familiar ingredients are already present, but later Bay films sometimes feel as though they're edited by someone operating at maximum sensory overload while fireworks explode in the background. Bad Boys still contains occasional moments where it actually breathes, and I think that's one of the reasons many people who normally dislike Bay's work still acknowledge this as one of his more entertaining films. The visual style enhances the experience instead of completely consuming it. At least most of the time, you can immediately tell Bay came from music videos and commercials. Every frame feels obsessed with movement and image. Characters don't simply enter scenes, they arrive. Cars aren't just parked in the background, they're introduced like celebrities. Even conversations sometimes feel staged like miniature music videos, with dramatic lighting and constant camera movement transforming ordinary dialogue into stylized spectacle. And strangely enough, that approach works perfectly for this film, because Bad Boys isn't trying to feel grounded. The movie exists entirely inside a heightened reality where everything appears louder, brighter, smoother, and more dramatic than actual life. And Bay instinctively understands that tone. Miami becomes this glowing fantasy city filled with neon lighting, expensive cars, palm trees, and sunsets that look almost too perfect to exist naturally. Honestly, half the film feels like someone transformed a music video into a police comedy, and I genuinely mean that as praise. There's also something refreshing about how confident the directing feels, especially considering this was Bay's first feature film. Many directorial debuts feel cautious. You can sense filmmakers trying carefully not to fail. Bay directs Bad Boys like someone already convinced he's making a blockbuster. Occasionally that confidence spills into excess, certainly, but the movie almost never feels hesitant. Even relatively small scenes are filmed with exaggerated intensity. A character opens a car door and the camera swings dramatically. Someone lights a cigarette in slow motion as probably involved. Two characters stand beside a sports car and suddenly the image resembles a magazine advertisement. That visual obsession would eventually become one of the most divisive aspects of Bay's entire career. Some viewers see it as pure style over substance filmmaking, others see it as the reason his action films feel larger, louder, and more energetic than many modern blockbusters. Honestly, both perspectives make sense, because Bay absolutely prioritizes sensation over subtlety. But with Bad Boys, there's still enough simplicity holding everything together. The story remains straightforward. The chemistry between Smith and Lawrence keeps the emotional center grounded, and because the movie doesn't yet have a massive Transformers-level budget, Bay can't completely drown every scene in digital excess. The limitations actually help him here. The action sequences especially reveal early signs of what he'd later become famous for. You can already see his obsession with momentum. May chases aren't merely about geography, they're about energy. Explosions aren't simply explosions, they function like visual punctuation marks. Bay wants movement constantly. Even scenes that don't technically require that level of intensity are directed as though the audience might lose interest if the camera holds still for more than a few seconds. And honestly, in the mid-90s, that style felt genuinely fresh. Action movies before this often carried a heavier, more grounded texture. Bay brought this hyper-stylized commercial energy into blockbuster filmmaking and fundamentally altered the rhythm of mainstream action cinema. Whether that was a positive development is still being debated decades later. What's interesting is that Bad Boys also contains early warning signs of Bay's weaknesses as a filmmaker. The movie occasionally mistakes noise for momentum. Certain scenes run longer than necessary because the visual style itself becomes the focus. Character moments sometimes get interrupted by unnecessary stylistic flourishes. The film can feel overproduced even when the material underneath remains relatively simple. But unlike some of Bay's later work, this movie still feels connected to its characters, And that distinction matters. Smith and Lawrence remain the center of attention rather than the spectacle itself. Bay clearly understands their chemistry is the real engine driving the movie, and the flashy visuals support that dynamic instead of replacing it. Later in his career, Bay would occasionally become so consumed by scale that human interaction almost disappeared beneath the sensory overload. Here, the chaos still has personality. And honestly, there's something genuinely charming about watching a filmmaker at the beginning of his cinematic identity, before it fully hardens into self-parody. Bad Boys feels like a director discovering what excites him visually and throwing all of it onto the screen at once. Some of it works beautifully, some of it feels excessive, sometimes it's both at once, but the energy is undeniable. Even people who dislike Bay's movies usually acknowledge he understands how to create movement. He understands cinematic velocity better than most blockbuster filmmakers. Bad Boys may not be sophisticated filmmaking, but it's very rarely lifeless. The movie constantly pushes forward with an aggressive confidence that keeps it entertaining even when the writing gets shaky. And honestly, for a feature film debut, it's kind of remarkable how fully formed the entire Michael Bay experience already feels here. The sunglasses, the sunsets, the explosions, the impossible coolness projected onto absolutely everything, and all begins here. One thing you genuinely cannot accuse Bad Boys of being is visually dull, subtle, perhaps, in isolated moments, but visually forgettable. Absolutely not. Michael Bay directs this movie as though every single frame is trying to sell you something: a car, a lifestyle, sunglasses, cigarettes, Miami itself. Every image radiates this exaggerated look. How incredible this is energy. And honestly, whether that style works for you is probably decided within the first 10 minutes. Because Bad Boys doesn't simply present scenes, it stages them like events. A more conventional director might film two detectives walking toward a car in a straightforward way. Bay transforms the same moment into spectacle. Slow motion, wind appearing from nowhere, low-angle camera shots, reflections sliding across polished surfaces, dramatic lighting with no practical motivation whatsoever. It's the kind of filmmaking where even standing still somehow feels aggressive. And strangely enough, that visual confidence gives the movie a very specific identity. The film operates with this hyper-glossy music video aesthetic that completely defines mid-90s blockbuster filmmaking. You can feel Bay's commercial background embedded into nearly every scene. The camera is constantly moving, circling characters, pushing into close-ups, gliding through environments as though remaining stationary would physically hurt it. Sometimes the visual rhythm almost feels anxious, like the movie is afraid audiences might lose interest if anything looks visually normal for more than a few seconds. But honestly, I think what keeps it from becoming exhausting is the atmosphere itself. Miami in this film doesn't resemble a real city, it resembles a fantasy version of Miami. Everything glows, the nights are drenched in neon blue, the daylight feels saturated with orange sunlight, every location looks suspiciously cinematic. Bay photographs palm trees and sports cars with the same dramatic intensity other filmmakers reserve for emotional confrontations, and honestly, there's something almost hypnotic about it. Even the lighting carries this exaggerated quality, with smoke drifting through half the interiors for no practical reason beyond how striking it looks once sunlight cuts through it. Nightclub sequences feel humid and chaotic, police stations feel louder than actual combat zones, apartments resemble magazine photo spreads. Nothing in this movie is allowed to look ordinary. The action sequences especially reveal how obsessed Bay already was with movement and visual impact. Explosions don't merely happen, they erupt, with debris flying directly toward the camera. Car chases are filmed with relentless momentum, so everything appears faster than it probably is. Even the gunfights have rhythm to them. Bay often edits scenes almost like music videos, prioritizing energy and sensation over realism or spatial geography. And honestly, I completely understand why audiences either love or reject that style, because there are absolutely moments where Bad Boys crosses directly into visual excess. Occasionally the movie feels like it's admiring its own style simply because certain shots linger slightly too long, Some scenes are lit so dramatically they almost become unintentionally amusing. Bay clearly loves striking imagery more than restrained storytelling, and the film never attempts to hide that preference. But there's also something admirable about how committed the movie is to its tone. It fully understands the kind of experience it wants to create. It wants heat, speed, chaos, attitude, everything heightened beyond reality, and visually it commits to that identity more aggressively than most action films from its era. You can already see the DNA of Bay's later films forming here, too. The rotating camera movements around characters, the low-angle hero shots, the obsession with sunsets, the polished reflective surfaces, the stylized slow motion, even the way characters are framed beside sports cars or explosions like they're posing for album covers. All of it eventually became part of Bay's signature visual language. What's interesting, though, is that compared to some of his later projects, Bad Boys still feels relatively controlled. Later Bay films occasionally become so overloaded with editing and spectacle that they almost dissolve into visual noise. Here, there's still enough restraint for scenes to remain coherent and readable. The style is loud, but it hasn't fully consumed the movie yet. And honestly, the cinematography does an enormous amount of work elevating material that's otherwise fairly straightforward. The plot itself is standard buddy cop structure. The villains aren't especially memorable. The investigation mostly exists to push characters toward the next major sequence. But the visual presentation constantly injects scenes with additional momentum. Bay understands how to make moments feel exciting even when the writing underneath is relatively simple. And that's a legitimate skill. There are technically stronger action scripts that feel completely lifeless because they're filmed without any personality. Bad Boys, at the very least, feels alive every second. Overstimulated, perhaps, but undeniably alive. The editing deserves significant credit as well, because the film's pacing depends heavily on visual rhythm. Quick cuts, music cues, dramatic camera swings. Everything works together to generate momentum. At times, the movie almost feels like it's moving forward purely through editing energy alone, and the soundtrack contributes enormously to that sensation. The music blends seamlessly with the visuals in that very specific 90s blockbuster style, where songs, slow motion, and camera movement all fuse into one giant stylistic package. It's excessive, it's glossy, occasionally it's genuinely ridiculous, but it's memorable. That's the key thing. Even audiences who dislike Bad Boys usually remember how it looked. The visual identity is simply too strong to ignore. You can pause almost any random frame from this movie and immediately recognize who directed it. For better or worse, Bay stamped his personality onto every inch of the film, and honestly, that commitment to visual identity is probably one of the reasons the movie remained embedded in pop culture for so long. It doesn't look generic, it looks aggressively, unapologetically like Michael Bay. One of the major reasons Bad Boys still lingers in people's memory, even when they barely remember the actual plot, is Miami. Not necessarily real Miami, but cinematic Miami, Michael Bay's version of Miami, which honestly feels like its own separate universe. The movie doesn't treat the city as a background setting, it treats it as the emotional atmosphere of the entire film. Everything feels drenched in heat. The streets glow orange, the nights are filled with neon blue lighting and drifting smoke, palm trees appear everywhere, sports cars move through traffic like every citizen is already late for an action sequence. Even ordinary conversations somehow feel humid, and honestly, without that atmosphere, I don't think the film works nearly as well. Structurally, the movie itself is fairly simple. A buddy cops, narcotics investigation, witness protection, explosions. Variations of this story existed long before Bad Boys and continued long afterward, but the Miami setting injects the film with a larger-than-life energy that keeps it feeling stylish even when the writing thins out. The movie creates this very specific fantasy version of 90s Miami, where everyone appears attractive, everyone owns expensive vehicles, nightclubs are permanently crowded, the ocean always seems nearby, and sunsets look suspiciously too perfect to be natural. Somehow every criminal operation in the city also appears connected to narcotics, luxury hotels, or speedboats. It's absurd, certainly. But the film commits so completely to the atmosphere that it eventually becomes immersive. You can also feel the influence of Miami Vice throughout the movie. That glossy, fashion commercial approach to crime storytelling, where style matters almost as much as narrative. Even the detectives themselves barely resemble ordinary police officers. Mike and Marcus move through the city like celebrities disguised as narcotics detectives. Mike especially feels perfectly designed for this environment. Expensive clothing, polished car, limitless confidence. The city almost feels like an extension of his personality. Marcus, meanwhile, feels like a man simply trying to survive the madness surrounding him. And honestly, I love that contrast, because Miami in this film feels seductive and chaotic at the same time. During the daytime sequences, the city looks warm, vibrant, almost inviting. Then night arrives and everything becomes darker, smokier, more dangerous. Michael Bay shifts the atmosphere visually without ever approaching subtlety. Blue lighting floods interiors, shadows stretch across rooms, clubs pulse with music and neon. It's exaggerated, certainly, but it gives the movie a very distinct atmosphere. Honestly, some sequences feel less like storytelling and more like Bay trying to preserve the coolness of 90s Miami culture before it vanished completely, and strangely enough, that gives the film a kind of nostalgia now, even for audiences who never actually lived through that era. The technology, the fashion, the soundtrack, the cars, all of it feels preserved inside this very specific mid-90s version of American action cinema, where absolutely everything needed to look polished all the time. Even police stations somehow feel stylish. Nobody sweats normally in this movie either. Everyone glistens dramatically beneath expensive lighting setups. There's also something about the city itself that amplifies the movie's momentum. The chases feel faster because of the open roads and oceanfront streets. The action scenes feel larger because the environment already feels oversized. Even quieter moments still contain movement somewhere in the background. Traffic, music, nightlife, crowds. Miami gives the film energy before the characters even begin speaking. And honestly, Bay photographs the city like he's completely fascinated by it, and not in a realistic or documentary sense. More like someone assembling an enormous visual mixtape dedicated to sports cars, beachfront nightlife, and beautiful people standing beside explosions. Every location feels chosen for maximum visual attitude. Hotels, clubs, luxury apartments, airports, marinas. The movie constantly moves through these exaggerated action film environments that make everything feel slightly larger than reality. What's interesting is that the city also distracts from how familiar the actual narrative structure is. If this exact same script took place in a visually flat or generic environment, I think audiences would notice the cliché copyright far more aggressively. But Miami gives Bad Boys flavor. It gives the film identity. You remember the feeling of the movie almost as much as the scenes themselves, and that matters. A lot of action films become interchangeable over time because they lack a strong atmosphere tying everything together. Bad Boys absolutely doesn't have that problem. You can pause random moments and immediately recognize the world the film exists inside. And honestly, I think the city also explains why the movie feels more playful than gritty. Even when genuinely dangerous things happen, the film rarely feels emotionally heavy for very long. Miami's glamorous, oversized atmosphere keeps pulling everything back toward entertainment. The setting itself almost refuses seriousness for extended periods. There's always another nightclub, another sports car, another stylized chase waiting around the corner. The film wants danger to feel exciting rather than emotionally draining, and Miami becomes the perfect environment for that tone. By the end, the city feels inseparable from the franchise's identity. You genuinely can't imagine Bad Boys functioning the same way anywhere else. The noise, the humor, the style, the velocity. Miami doesn't simply host the story, it amplifies everything about it. Honestly, The movie occasionally feels less like a story set in Miami and more like Michael Bay attempting to turn Miami into a 2-hour adrenaline commercial, and somehow, it actually works. If there's one thing Bad Boys completely understands, it's how to make action feel loud and not realistic, not tactical, not grounded, just loud. This movie doesn't really believe in small-scale action sequences. Even minor confrontations are directed as though the entire city of Miami is seconds away from total collapse. Cars tear through intersections at impossible speeds. Bullets hit everything except the people firing them. Every explosion feels emotionally overcommitted in the most entertaining way possible. And honestly, that becomes part of the charm. The action in Bad Boys isn't memorable because it's especially original. Most of the setups are actually very familiar: car chases, warehouse shootouts, nightclub chaos, airport finales. This is classic buddy cop action material, but Bay attacks every sequence with so much momentum that the movie almost convinces you you're watching something larger than it actually is. That's the real trick. The film constantly feels more expensive than it probably was, especially compared to the enormous budgets Bay would later command. You can already see his obsession with momentum here. Everything moves quickly, sometimes absurdly so. Characters enter scenes already yelling. Cars don't simply drive, they launch themselves through traffic as if physics personally offended them. Gunfights erupt suddenly and escalate almost immediately into complete destruction. Bay directs action with the philosophy that more is more, where subtle escalation barely exists at all. If one shot is fired, expect 30 more within seconds. And honestly, the car chases are probably where the film feels most alive. There's a raw, reckless energy to them that still works surprisingly well. They aren't perfectly clean or technically precise the way modern stunt-driven action films often are. Sometimes the editing gets chaotic. Sometimes continuity barely survives between shots, but there's physical weight and aggression to the movement that keeps the sequences exciting. You feel the speed, and that matters enormously. A lot of modern action movies are technically larger than Bad Boys, but they can feel strangely weightless because everything dissolves into digital blur. Here, even when the film gets exaggerated, there's still physicality to the crashes, the gunfire, the shattered glass, the spinning vehicles. Objects collide with satisfying force, and Bay absolutely loves destruction, not in a dark or disturbing sense, more like a kid smashing action figures together while making explosion sounds. The movie blows things up because explosions are exciting. That's essentially the guiding philosophy here. There's no deeper commentary attached to it. Bay wants spectacle, noise, flames, debris flying toward the camera. Pure sensory overload. The nightclub sequence especially feels like early Bay discovering exactly how much visual chaos he can extract from a single environment. Flashing lights, smoke, screaming, gunfire, music overwhelming everything. It's messy in a very deliberate way. You're not really supposed to calmly analyze the geography of the sequence. You're supposed to feel consumed by its energy. And then there's the airport hangar finale, which honestly feels like the movie abandoning any remaining restraint and fully embracing action film insanity. By that stage, subtlety is completely gone. Everyone is firing automatic weapons non-stop. Explosions erupt every few minutes, and Mike and Marcus basically become unstoppable engines of chaos sprinting through total destruction. It's excessive, completely excessive. But it's also exactly the kind of climax the movie promises from the very beginning. You can tell Bay loves filming finales, as though civilization itself might end before the credits roll. What's funny is that the action scenes are deeply connected to the movie's obsession with coolness. Nobody survives danger in a normal way. Characters leap away from explosions in slow motion, guns are spun dramatically, cars drift sideways at suspiciously cinematic angles. Even reloading a weapon feels choreographed, like part of someone's fashion routine. The film constantly wants the audience thinking that looked incredible, and honestly, a lot of the time it genuinely does. Now, obviously, the second you start questioning realism, the whole thing collapses instantly. These detectives caused unbelievable levels of property destruction, Bullets somehow miss constantly until the narrative suddenly requires them to connect. Characters survive situations they realistically shouldn't survive. Logic matters less than rhythm. But Bad Boys understands that this style of action filmmaking was never really designed around realism in the first place. It's built around adrenaline. The movie wants its action sequences to feel exciting first and believable somewhere much further down the priority list. Michael Bay treats explosions almost like musical punctuation. The action scenes are constructed around emotional intensity and visual impact more than tactical precision. And whether audiences admire or reject his style, he undeniably understands how to generate cinematic momentum. There's also something very physical about the action in this movie that I genuinely miss in many modern blockbusters. Characters look exhausted, they shout over each other, the environments feel hot, chaotic, loud, cars bounce violently during chases, shootouts feel messy instead of perfectly choreographed. The film embraces disorder. And honestly, that roughness helps enormously, because beneath all the oversized visuals and escalating destruction, the action still feels connected to the personalities of Mike and Marcus. One man stays composed under pressure, the other emotionally unravels every few minutes. Even during massive action sequences, their reactions keep everything entertaining. And that matters, because spectacle alone becomes repetitive very quickly. The movie works best when the action feels like an extension of the chemistry between the leads rather than random explosions occurring in empty space. And honestly, Bad Boys may not contain the smartest action sequences of the 90s, but it absolutely contains some of the most energetic. The film attacks every chase, shootout, and explosion with such aggressive confidence that even when scenes become ridiculous, they rarely feel lifeless. You can criticize the movie for excess, you can criticize it for noise, you can absolutely argue it loves explosions a little too enthusiastically, but it's difficult to accuse it of lacking energy. The comedy in Bad Boys is honestly chaotic in a very specific way, a not carefully engineered comedy, either. It feels loud, improvisational, occasionally messy, sometimes as though the movie itself isn't entirely sure whether it wants to be an action film with comedic elements or a comedy that accidentally wandered into a shootout. And strangely enough, that uncertainty actually benefits the movie, because the humor here doesn't really come from elaborate setups or sophisticated punchlines. Most of it comes from personality collision, Mike and Marcus responding to stress in completely different ways. One man trying desperately to stay composed while the other emotionally spirals in public. That becomes the real comedic engine of the film. And honestly, Martin Lawrence carries an enormous amount of that energy. Marcus spends most of the movie sounding like a man perpetually seconds away from a nervous collapse. He overreacts constantly, argues during dangerous situations, complains non-stop even while bullets are flying nearby. He somehow still finds time to yell at Mike about unrelated personal frustrations. That frantic energy becomes hilarious specifically because Will Smith plays Mike with the exact opposite rhythm. Mike treats chaos like a mild inconvenience at worst, while Marcus reacts like the universe has personally targeted him. So every scene becomes a fascinating balancing act between calm confidence and total emotional exhaustion, and the film understands that dynamic immediately. What I genuinely appreciate is that the humor rarely feels overly polished. The dialogue has a loose, overlapping rhythm where characters constantly interrupt one another. Some conversations barely even sound scripted. It feels more like two comedians trying to outreact each other in real time. Sometimes jokes don't even land perfectly, but the scene still works because the chemistry feels authentic. And that matters. There are action comedies where every joke feels painfully manufactured, like you can hear the screenplay desperately asking for audience laughter. Bad Boys is rougher than that. Some jokes are silly, some are genuinely effective, and some scenes become entertaining purely because Smith and Lawrence keep escalating each other's energy until everything turns absurd. Looking back now, what's genuinely remarkable about Bad Boys is realizing how many careers quietly shifted because of this one film. At the time, nobody really knew this movie would become a franchise still running nearly 30 years later. On paper, It was basically another mid-90s buddy cop action movie arriving in a Hollywood landscape already overflowing with the mail-out detectives, explosions, narcotics, criminals, Miami sunsets. There wasn't much reason to assume this particular film would become culturally durable, but somehow it did. And honestly, I think that comes down to timing almost as much as anything else, because Bad Boys arrived precisely when multiple people involved were standing at major turning points in their careers. Will Smith especially. Watching the movie now feels fascinating because you can literally see the exact moment he transforms from popular television personality into genuine movie star material. Before this, Smith was obviously already famous because of The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, but Bad Boys feels like Hollywood collectively realizing, oh, this guy can lead major action movies too. And honestly, the confidence is already there. Even in his earliest scenes, Smith moves through the film like someone who instinctively understands movie stardom. The charisma feels effortless. The camera responds to him immediately. Bay clearly recognizes that too, because half the movie frames Mike like a future icon before audiences even fully knew what Smith's career was about to become. And then, after this, Independence Day, Men in Black. Suddenly Will Smith becomes one of the biggest movie stars on the planet for years afterward. So revisiting Bad Boys now almost feels like watching the launch sequence happen in real time. Martin Lawrence's trajectory is fascinating too, because back then he was arguably the bigger comedic name. Younger audiences sometimes forget that Lawrence was massive during that period. At the sitcom success, the stand-up popularity, the larger-than-life comedy persona, he already carried enormous momentum. And honestly, Bad Boys works partly because the film understands exactly how to weaponize his chaotic comedic energy. Marcus could very easily have become exhausting in the wrong hands. Lawrence somehow makes him genuinely lovable even while shouting through half the runtime. And the chemistry between him and Smith ended up becoming one of those rare casting combinations Hollywood spends decades trying to recreate afterward. Not because the characters themselves were deeply original on paper, but because the energy between the actors feels impossible to manufacture artificially. That's really the secret behind the franchise surviving. Not the harrowing investigations, not the villains, not even the action itself. It's Mike and Marcus, always Mike and Marcus. Even when the later sequels became bigger, louder, and more excessive, audiences kept returning because they wanted more time with those personalities. The franchise gradually became less about crime stories and more about the relationship itself, and honestly, that's surprisingly rare for action franchises. Many action series survive because of mythology or spectacle. Bad Boys survives because viewers genuinely enjoy spending time with these two chaotic detectives while Miami disintegrates around them. Michael Bay's career obviously transformed dramatically after this too. Again, revisiting the film now feels strange because you can already see the full Michael Bay experience forming before Hollywood fully understood what he was going to become. The visual style, the oversized confidence, the obsession with movement, spectacle, and cinematic excess, it's all already here in early form. And after Bad Boys, Bay essentially became one of the defining blockbuster directors of his generation, whether critics appreciated it or not. The Rock, Armageddon, Pearl Harbor, Transformers. For better or worse, mainstream Hollywood action cinema started carrying Bay's fingerprints everywhere afterward, which honestly makes Bad Boys historically important beyond simply being entertaining. It marks the beginning of multiple blockbuster identities at the same time. What I also find genuinely interesting is how the franchise itself evolved over time. The original movie feels rougher, smaller, and more chaotic in a strangely charming way. Later entries became larger and more polished, but they also lost some of that unpredictable "we're figuring this out as we go" energy the first film possesses so naturally. There's something very alive about the original, messy sometimes, absolutely, but undeniably alive. And honestly, that's probably why it carries nostalgic power for so many people now. The movie feels tied to a very specific era, when action blockbusters still had rough edges.